Your wife fell there, said girl to millionaire with bride missing on wedding day. Then they called the police to check the well that the girl showed and discover something shocking. Comment saying from which city you're watching me. I really want to know where you are from and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The screams sliced through the hot afternoon air of Charleston like a sharp blade, echoing through the narrow streets of the historic district precisely at 3 o'clock. Richard Huntington, 52, nearly dropped his coffee mug as he recoiled abruptly from the window of his condo. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity that made his muscles contract involuntarily. For 4 consecutive weeks, that sound had been coming from the weathered Victorian house across the street from his modern building, a 2-story structure with peeling blue shutters that contrasted starkly with the elegance of the building where he lived. Richard adjusted his Italian tie with trembling fingers and muttered to himself that it must just be a child's tantrum. As the owner of Huntington Construction, one of the most prosperous companies in the region, he was accustomed to solving complex problems involving millions of dollars, but preferred to maintain absolute distance from other people's personal dramas. Especially after 5 years living in complete emotional isolation since he lost his wife, Emily, on that rainy night that still haunted him in recurring nightmares. Across the street, inside the dimly lit kitchen of the Victorian house, Lily Johnson, just 4 years old, huddled in the darkest corner, her thin arms trembling with terror. Her small legs could barely support her as she watched her Aunt Carol, 38, holding a metal spoon firmly that she had just heated in the high flames of the gas stove. Carol's eyes were red and bloodshot, not only from the bourbon she had been consuming since noon at O'Malley's pub, but also from the constant anger that seemed to consume every fibre of her being. She fixed her icy gaze on the girl who was trembling before her, like a predator studying its prey before the final attack. "You're a curse on this house," Carol hissed, her slurred and raspy voice echoing through the peeling walls of the kitchen. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything I had in life." The incandescent spoon descended with calculated force on Lily's small arm, leaving a red and painful mark that would join the dozens of other scars that already dotted her delicate skin, like a cruel map of suffering. The girl bit her lower lip so hard that she felt the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, desperately struggling not to scream louder. During these terrible months, Lily had learned through pain that screams only enraged her aunt even more, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by the bourbon addiction that controlled every aspect of her life. The girl closed her eyes tightly and tried to transport herself mentally to the fragmented memories of her mother, Jessica, singing that soft lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, scattered pieces of memories and a song that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful and desperate moments. Jessica had passed away 8 months ago, leaving Lily in the care of a sister who blamed her for all her failures and frustrations. "Stop whining like a wounded animal," Carol grunted, putting the metal spoon in the old cabinet as if it were the most natural and mundane gesture in the world. "Go to your filthy room, and I don't want to see your face until tomorrow morning. And if I find out you've dirtied the walls again with that charcoal, you'll experience a punishment you haven't experienced yet." Lily ran through the dark corridors of the house until she reached the small room in the back, a stuffy and claustrophobic space that contained only an old bed with rusty springs and a dusty crucifix hanging on the cracked wall. There she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, allowing the familiar melody to transport her away from that brutal reality. What Lily didn't know was that across the street, someone had finally paid true attention to that melody that echoed through the afternoon. Richard abruptly stopped reviewing the million-dollar contracts spread out on his mahogany desk when he heard the faint but unmistakably distinct sound reaching his window. He knew that particular song. Emily used to hum it while preparing dinner in their gourmet kitchen, a popular American folk song that spoke of free birds flying aimlessly across the infinite skies. But where exactly did this ghostly melody come from that awakened long-buried memories? Richard approached the panoramic window again, his eyes meticulously scanning every detail of the deteriorated facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there emanated that trembling but persistent childish voice, laden with a sadness that seemed too old for such a small child. For the first time, in 4 weeks of sporadic screams, Richard felt something profoundly different from the simple annoyance that made him close the windows. There was something in that delicate voice that touched a sensitive chord long dormant in his hardened chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities and commitments that he had buried under thick layers of obsessive work and emotional isolation. In the modest house next to the Victorian construction, Martha Peterson, a retired teacher of 61 years, carefully watered her begonias when the girl's melancholic song reached her experienced ears. Unlike Richard, she could no longer ignore the disturbing signs that accumulated day after day. During her 40 years dedicated to elementary education, Martha had developed a sharp and almost infallible instinct to recognize children in situations of suffering, and that small voice carried a deep and ancient pain that made her educator's heart contract with anguish and concern. Martha watched the closed windows of the Johnsons' house, a family she had known for several decades as neighbors. Carol had always been a problematic and unstable person, but since she had assumed legal custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed drastically in the environment of that residence. The girl never played in the sunny backyard, never ran through the historic streets like all the other children in town. The teacher wiped her muddy hands on her floral apron and made a decision that would change the course of the next events. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor Carol. It had been a long time since she had had a proper conversation with her, and perhaps it was time to get to know little Lily better. Meanwhile, Richard remained still near the window, an uncomfortable and disturbing feeling growing in his chest like a seed of restlessness. The children's song had stopped abruptly, but something in those few minutes had awakened specific memories that he preferred to keep locked in secure compartments of his mind. Vivid memories of Jessica Johnson, his former employee who had resigned completely abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the tragic accident that took Emily. Jessica was a kind and dedicated woman, always humming American folk songs while meticulously organizing the important files of the construction company. Then, without any explanation or prior warning, she had simply disappeared from his professional and personal life, leaving only a formal and laconic resignation letter full of questions that were never answered. Richard had never consciously thought about her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child was clearly suffering in absolute silence. The end of the afternoon brought with it the long shadows of the hills that surrounded Charleston, and Lily finally fell asleep in her stuffy room, completely exhausted by the physical pain and constant fear that dominated every moment of her existence. Her small fingers squeezed the tattered sheet as if it were her only anchor in an ocean of suffering. Across the street, Richard closed the heavy drapes and tried to return to work. But his mind could not focus on the numbers and contracts that normally dominated his thoughts. Something fundamental had changed that sunny afternoon, something that he did not yet fully understand, but that was beginning to grow within him like a seed of long-dormant responsibility. The next morning arrived accompanied by the comforting aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the characteristic movement of Charleston, awakening to another day of routine. Martha Peterson wore her best navy blue floral dress and combed her grey hair with meticulous care, even applying a discreet lipstick that she rarely used. There was something in the child's voice that did not allow her to find peace, a persistent echo of hopelessness that she perfectly recognized from her decades as an educator specializing in children with emotional difficulties. At 9 o'clock sharp, she crossed the cobblestone street and knocked on the heavy door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the seemingly empty interior until shuffling and hesitant steps approached slowly. Carol opened the door only a crack, revealing a bloated face and red eyes that clearly denounced the devastating effects of the previous night's binge drinking. Her breath carried the acrid smell of bourbon, mixed with something sour that made Martha disguise a grimace of repulsion. "Good morning, Carol, dear," Martha said with her warmest and most convincing smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation between neighbors." Carol hesitated visibly, running a trembling hand through her disheveled and oily hair that had not seen shampoo for several days. Her rumpled clothes denounced that she had slept dressed on the living room sofa, probably in another episode of drunkenness that had extended through the early hours. "Oh, Mrs. Peterson, It's not exactly a good time for visitors," she stammered, trying to block the view of the interior of the house with her thin body. "The house is completely messed up. You know how it is." "Imagine, my dear. We've been neighbors for so many years," Martha insisted, taking a determined step forward and forcing Carol to recoil involuntarily. "And I would immensely like to get to know your niece better. I've heard comments that she's an absolutely adorable girl." Carol's face hardened instantly, her features contracting in a defensive expression before forcing a yellow and completely artificial smile. "Lily is... well, she's quite sick today, very high fever since yesterday. It would be better not to get close so as not to run risks." At that precise moment, a soft but distinctive noise reached them, coming from the direction of the kitchen, the unmistakable sound of something small being dragged carefully across the old wooden floor. Martha pricked up her trained ears, immediately recognizing the movements of a child trying to move with as much silence as possible. "Maybe I can be helpful in some way," the teacher insisted with growing firmness. "I have a lot of experience taking care of sick children. I raised 3 children to adulthood. You know perfectly well how it is." "No need to bother, Mrs. Peterson," Carol replied with suspicious speed, positioning her thin body to completely block the entrance. "I already consulted a doctor yesterday. It's just a common cold. It will soon pass without major complications." Martha carefully observed Carol's nervous hands, the way she avoided any direct eye contact, and especially the intense and penetrating smell of alcohol that emanated from her even so early in the morning. All were signs that she had learned to recognize and interpret during her decades dealing with problematic and dysfunctional families. Across the street, Richard watched the entire interaction through his panoramic window while drinking his imported breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused and fragmented dreams where the voice of a child mixed inexplicably with specific memories of Jessica Johnson humming through the construction company. When he saw Martha positioned at the door of the Victorian house, a strange and growing curiosity began to form in his mind. There was something in the teacher's determination that intrigued him deeply, as if she knew information that he completely ignored. The teacher finally said goodbye to Carol after several minutes of polite insistence, but not without casting an inquisitive and insightful look into the dark interior of the house through the crack in the door. Her decades of educational experience screamed that there was something deeply disturbed in that residence, and that a child was suffering some kind of serious situation. As she walked slowly back to her house, Martha made a fundamental decision that would completely change the course of events. She needed to find an effective way to verify her growing suspicions about the well-being of little Lily, even if it meant taking more drastic measures. Inside the Victorian house, Carol locked the door with excessive force and went immediately to the kitchen, where she found Lily crouching behind the old wooden table, trying to hide like a cornered animal. The girl had desperately tried to reach a glass of water from the high sink, but her small stature did not allow it, and she had knocked over a wooden chair in the process. "Didn't I clearly tell you to stay in your room?" Carol growled, her irritation being exponentially intensified by the throbbing hangover and the unexpected visit that had awakened her paranoia. "What part of my orders couldn't you understand?" "I was very thirsty, Aunt Carol," Lily murmured with her small and trembling voice, keeping her big and scared eyes fixed on the dirty wooden floor. "I just wanted a little water." "Thirsty?" Carol laughed with a bitterness that echoed through the peeling walls of the kitchen. "You want water? Then you can go get it in the backyard. And since you like to make noise and attract unwanted attention so much, you can stay out there until I decide you deserve to come in again." Lily obediently went out to the small yard surrounded by high brick walls, an arid space dominated only by a single oak tree that offered partial shade. There she sat on the dry earth and began to draw carefully with a piece of charcoal that she had found near the gas stove during the early hours. They were always birds, small, large, some flying with open wings, others perched on imaginary branches that existed only in her childish mind. Each stroke represented her deepest dream of freedom, of being able to fly far away from that house where pain was her only constant and predictable companion. The hours dragged slowly under the scorching sun of the Charleston midday. Carol had deliberately locked the back door, leaving Lily in the yard without access to water or food, under the temperature that easily exceeded 90 degrees. The girl began to feel worrying dizziness, but she knew from painful experience that knocking on the door would only result in even more severe punishments. It was then that she began to sing her mother's comforting song softly, allowing the familiar melody to become her only source of comfort in the midst of the suffocating heat and growing thirst. It was this same melody that again reached the attentive ears of Richard, who this time could not simply ignore the sound. There was something too familiar in that specific voice, in that particular song that awakened buried memories. Richard picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking consciously, began to record the audio. He didn't know exactly why he was doing this, but a deep instinct told him that he might need that sound evidence in the near future. As he recorded, scattered fragments of memories began to fit slowly into his mind like pieces of a complex puzzle. Jessica Johnson hummed exactly that same song while working meticulously in his construction company. Jessica, who had been an exemplary and dedicated employee until disappearing completely abruptly and inexplicably. Jessica, who always spoke with maternal affection about her little daughter, a girl named Lily, Richard murmured aloud, the cell phone trembling visibly in his sweaty hands. Jessica's daughter was called exactly Lily, and she would be approximately 4 years old now. The understanding hit Richard like a devastating punch in the stomach. The child who was suffering in the house in front was the daughter of his former employee, the kind and hard-working woman who had simply disappeared from his life without adequate explanations. How hadn't he established this obvious connection before? Richard put away his phone and began to walk compulsively back and forth in his luxurious apartment. He vaguely remembered Jessica mentioning serious family problems, a sister with whom she maintained an extremely complicated relationship, growing financial difficulties that constantly worried her. But he was completely absorbed in his own problems at the time, the marital conflicts that intensified with Emily, the financial pressures of the expanding company, that he had not paid due attention to the distress signals that Jessica was probably sending discreetly. Now, 5 years after this neglect, Jessica's daughter was literally across the street, and from the disturbing sounds that came from that house daily, she was not living in a remotely adequate situation. The guilt that Richard carried for the tragic loss of his wife multiplied exponentially, now including the deep regret for not helping Jessica when she clearly needed support. Exactly at 3 in the afternoon, like a macabre and predictable ritual, the desperate screams restarted with the same terrifying intensity. This time, however, Richard did not move away from the window or try to ignore the sound. He watched with growing horror and visceral revolution, while through the blurred window of the kitchen of the Victorian house, he could vaguely distinguish a female silhouette moving in a clearly aggressive way. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record with renewed determination, this time with a much clearer and more urgent purpose. What he managed to capture through the small screen of the device left him physically nauseated and emotionally devastated. Carol was holding something in her hands that shone under the afternoon light. It seemed to be a superheated metal spoon, and gestured violently in the direction of a small figure that Richard could barely distinguish through the blurred window. Lily's screams echoed through the neighborhood with an intensity that made Richard's blood run cold in his veins. When the silence finally returned after several agonizing minutes, he remained glued to the window with his heart racing, the phone still recording in his trembling hands. He had just witnessed something that would completely change the course of his life, and that would force him to make decisions that he had been postponing for years. That same afternoon, Martha took an action that would define the fate of all those involved. Unable to take away from her mind the image of the scared eyes that she had glimpsed through the crack in the door, she went to the historic center of Charleston, where the small but efficient Office of Child Protective Services operated. Annabelle Montgomery, 34, was a dedicated social worker who had been a student of Martha's 2 decades ago. When the retired teacher entered the modest office without announcing her visit, Annabelle immediately noticed the gravity stamped on the face of her former educator. "Mrs. Peterson, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you here today?" asked Annabelle, rising from her desk covered with processes and documents. "Annabelle, my dear, I need to talk to you about an extremely delicate situation," said Martha, her voice carrying an urgency that drew immediate attention. "It's about a child who I believe is in real danger." Annabelle sat down again, her expression instantly changing to the professional mode she had developed over her 8 years protecting vulnerable children. During this period, she had learned to recognize when a complaint deserved immediate attention, and Martha Peterson was definitely not the type of person who would make unfounded accusations. "Tell me all the details, teacher. Don't leave anything out," said Annabelle, picking up a pen and opening a new official complaint form. While Martha meticulously reported her disturbing observations on the other side of the city, Richard was on a phone call that he hadn't made for months. He had contacted Dr. David Miller, his personal lawyer and college friend, a 48-year-old man known for his discretion and efficiency in delicate matters. "David, I urgently need your help with a situation that could be a matter of life," said Richard, pacing nervously through the apartment while observing the Victorian house through the window. "It involves a little girl, and I have evidence that she may be being systematically abused." David was silent for a few seconds, processing the seriousness in his friend's tone of voice. He had known Richard for almost 3 decades and knew that he was not given to unnecessary dramatizations or involvement in other people's personal affairs. "Richard, this is extremely serious. If you have concrete evidence of child abuse, we need to contact the competent authorities immediately," replied David with professional firmness. "We can't waste time." "I know that," said Richard, running his free hand through his graying hair. "But there's something more complicated. The child is the daughter of a former employee of mine, Jessica Johnson. She worked for me for 3 years before disappearing completely in 2019. David paused, immediately understanding the emotional implications of the situation. "You feel responsible. If I had paid more attention at the time, if I had offered help when she was clearly going through difficulties, maybe Jessica wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with that woman," admitted Richard, his voice laden with guilt and regret. At that moment, the screams restarted coming from the Victorian house, even though it wasn't the usual time of 3 in the afternoon. Both men could hear through the phone, and David immediately understood the urgent gravity of the situation. "Richard, does this happen regularly?" he asked, alarmed. "Daily, always at the same time. But today it's different, more intense," replied Richard, observing through the window while shadows moved violently inside the house. "I have recordings, David. Evidence of what's happening. On the other side of town, Annabelle was finishing noting Martha's detailed account when her phone rang urgently. It was a direct call from the district attorney. Child Protective Services. Annabelle speaking. Annabelle, this is District Attorney Frank Thompson. I need you to make an emergency intervention at a residence on King Street. We have just received compelling evidence of serious child abuse," said the authoritative voice on the other end of the line. Annabelle paused, her pen suspended over the paper where she had just documented Martha's complaint. "Is it by any chance house number 127? Yellow Victorian construction with blue shutters?" "Exactly. How did you know?" asked the prosecutor, surprised. "Mrs. Peterson," Annabelle murmured, looking at her former educator with a mixture of surprise and confirmation. "I just received a complaint about exactly the same house. Two completely independent sources reporting the same situation." District Attorney Thompson was silent for a moment before responding firmly. "This definitely confirms the seriousness of the situation. Two simultaneous complaints about the same case. We need to act today, Annabelle. I'm preparing a court order for immediate removal of the child." Meanwhile, in the Victorian house, something had changed drastically in the dynamic of daily suffering. Carol had discovered the secret drawings that Lily made on the walls during the early hours, small birds drawn with charcoal that represented her dreams of freedom. The discovery had triggered an even more intense fury than usual. "How many times do I need to tell you not to dirty these filthy walls?" shouted Carol, holding Lily by the arm with enough force to leave visible purple marks. "You're a plague, a curse that destroyed my life." Lily tried to explain with her small and scared voice that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone in the world, but her words were lost in desperate sobs. At only 4 years old, she still couldn't fully understand why her aunt hated her with such intensity, why each new day brought only growing pain and fear. "You're going to be locked in your room until I decide what to do with you," continued Carol, pushing the girl brutally through the dark corridor. "And if I hear a single noise, you're going to experience a punishment you haven't experienced in your miserable life." The room where Lily was imprisoned was small, stuffy and claustrophobic, with only one window too high for her to reach. There, curled up in the darkest corner, she began to sing her mother's comforting song softly, allowing the familiar melody to become her only escape from a reality that seemed to have no end. It was exactly this melancholic song that Martha heard when she passed by the Johnsons' house again, on the way back from Child Protective Services. The teacher stopped in front of the rusty iron gate and listened attentively. Lily's voice was even weaker than before, laden with a sadness so deep that it made Martha's experienced heart break. In that moment of absolute clarity, she knew that she had made the right decision by reporting the situation. A child was suffering a few feet from her house, and she couldn't continue pretending she didn't know what was happening. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being carefully organized. Annabelle, accompanied by 2 experienced social workers and a court officer, was preparing to head to King Street. Martha had offered to accompany the team, using her vast experience with traumatized children to facilitate the first contact with Lily. Across the street, Richard watched all the movements through his panoramic window, his heart beating with growing force in his chest. After days of emotional paralysis and torturous inaction, he had finally managed to turn his guilt into concrete action. David was on his way to his apartment to follow the developments of the operation. "You did the right thing, Richard," said David through the phone, his voice carrying conviction. "Regardless of what happens from now on, you chose to protect a helpless child. I just hope it's not too late. replied Richard, watching the Child Protective Services team approaching the Victorian house. Jessica trusted me in some way, even if indirectly. Now it's my responsibility to ensure that her daughter is safe. In the Johnsons' house, Carol had gone out to buy more alcohol at O'Malley's pub, leaving Lily completely alone and locked in the suffocating room. The girl continued singing her song of hope, without knowing that her life was about to change, radically and definitively. When Annabelle knocked firmly on the door of the Victorian house and received no response, she used her legal authority to enter the property through a side window that was ajar. What the team found inside the residence exceeded even their worst professional expectations. The house was a devastating portrait of neglect and abandonment. Walls with moisture stains, penetrating smell of alcohol mixed with mold, broken furniture scattered around the room, and especially small drawings of birds made with charcoal on the kitchen walls, the silent cry of a child for freedom. Annabelle followed the faint sound of a children's melody that echoed through the dark corridors of the residence. It was Martha who first clearly heard the delicate voice coming from the room in the back. "Someone's here," she whispered, guiding the team through the narrow corridor to a door locked from the outside. When they managed to open it and found Lily curled up in the darkest corner of the stuffy room, singing her song of hope, all the adults present felt a painful squeeze in their chests. The girl raised her big and scared eyes, completely not understanding who those unknown people were or what they wanted from her. Her thin body was covered by dirty and torn clothes, and the recent burn marks on her arms told a story of suffering that no child should know. "Hi, my dear," said Annabelle with her softest voice, squatting carefully to get down to the child's height. "My name is Annabelle. We came here to help you, okay?" Lily looked directly at Martha, immediately recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her through the backyard fence a few days before. A small flash of hope shone in her dark eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the conditioned fear that dominated every aspect of her existence. "Aunt Carol is going to be very angry with me," she whispered with her trembling voice, instinctively shrinking even further into the corner of the room. "You don't need to worry about that anymore," said Martha, extending her wrinkled but warm hand towards the girl. "We're going to get out of here right now, my dear. To a place where no one will ever hurt you again." And so, after 8 endless months of daily and silent suffering, Lily was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain, fear, and neglect. Her small hands gripped firmly Martha's safe hand as they crossed the door that had been her prison for so long. Across the street, Richard watched the entire operation through his window, a complex mixture of deep relief and growing anxiety dominating his thoughts. David had arrived and remained by his side, both witnessing the moment that would definitely change Lily's destiny. "And now what happens to her?" asked Richard, his voice laden with genuine concern. "Normally, she would be referred to a temporary shelter while an appropriate family is sought," explained David. "But given your involvement in the situation and your connection with the child's mother..." Richard interrupted his friend with a determination that surprised them both. "I want to adopt her, David. I want Lily to come live with me." The decision had sprung spontaneously from a deep place in his heart, but the moment the words left his mouth, he knew with absolute certainty that that was exactly what he needed to do. For 5 years, he had lived isolated in his guilt and sadness, but watching that child's suffering had awakened something that he thought he had lost forever. David looked at his friend with genuine surprise. "Richard, are you sure about this? Adopting a traumatized child is a huge responsibility, especially considering that I've lived alone for 5 years, and that I've never allowed myself to feel responsible for anyone else," completed Richard. "Maybe that's exactly why I need to do this. Jessica was an important person in my life, even if I didn't realize it at the time. Her daughter can't grow up among strangers when I have the means to offer her everything she deserves." In the days that followed, while Lily stayed temporarily under the specialized care of Martha, who had immediately offered herself as a provisional caregiver. Richard began the legal adoption process with a determination that impressed even David. Lily's first visit to Richard's luxurious apartment was a delicate and emotional moment. The girl entered timidly into the spacious and well-lit space, her big eyes scanning every detail with a mixture of fascination and distrust. It was so different from everything she knew that it seemed like she was entering a completely new world. "Do you like to draw?" asked Richard, showing her a low table that he had bought especially, full of blank paper, colored pencils and crayons. It was the first time in months that he had seen a genuine smile light up the girl's delicate face. "Can I draw birds?" she asked with her small but hopeful voice. "You can draw as many birds as you want," replied Richard, feeling a deep emotion upon realizing how something so simple could bring joy to that child who had suffered so much. While Lily dedicated herself to her colorful drawings, Richard made a decision that would completely change the course of his company. He sold Huntington Construction to a group of investors and used a significant portion of the money to create the Jessica Johnson Foundation, an organization dedicated to identifying and protecting children in situations of vulnerability throughout the region of South Carolina. "Jessica always worried about homeless children," he explained to David during one of the meetings to formalize the foundation. "I remember her commenting on cases she saw in the city, always wanting to help but without resources. Now I can do it for her and for her daughter." Martha naturally became the first educational director of the foundation, using her 4 decades of experience to develop programs for early identification of signs of child abuse. Her house was transformed into a temporary shelter center for children at risk, always with the full support of the foundation. Annabelle was invited to coordinate the social assistance department of the organization, drastically expanding her ability to handle complex cases throughout the region. For the first time in her career, she had adequate resources to offer full support to families in difficulty. As for Carol, she was referred to an intensive rehabilitation program for drug addicts, fully funded by the foundation. Richard had insisted that she receive professional help instead of simply being punished, understanding that her addiction had been the catalyst for her violence against Lily. 6 months after the official adoption, Lily had transformed into a completely different child. Her smile was frequent and genuine. Her night terrors had decreased drastically, and she developed a relationship of deep trust and affection with Richard, who discovered in fatherhood a source of joy that he had never experienced. "Daddy Richard," she called him now, running into his arms every time he came home from work at the foundation. "I drew a giant bird today. Do you want to see?" The house that before echoed only with the silence of loneliness now vibrated with children's laughter, songs sung in duet, the same melody that Jessica had taught her daughter, and the sound of little feet running through the corridors that had remained empty for so long. Richard discovered that taking care of Lily not only filled the void he had carried since Emily's departure, but also gave him a purpose greater than any business success had provided. Each smile of the girl, each progress in her emotional recovery, each colored drawing glued on the refrigerator represented a victory over suffering and proof that second chances really exist. The Jessica Johnson Foundation grew rapidly, identifying and helping dozens of children in situations similar to what Lily had lived. Martha, Annabelle, and Richard worked as a dedicated team, each contributing their specific skills to create a protection network that worked efficiently and humanely. A year after the rescue, during Lily's 5th birthday, the entire chosen family was gathered at the dinner table of the apartment that was now truly a home. Martha had prepared a special cake, Annabelle brought educational gifts, and David attended with his wife and children to celebrate. "Make a wish, my dear," said Richard, helping Lily blow out the colorful candles on the cake. Lily closed her eyes tightly and whispered her secret wish. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Richard with her eyes shining with happiness. "I asked that all the little birds in the world be free like I am now," she said, making all the adults present smile with emotion. Richard hugged her affectionately, understanding that that little child had taught him something fundamental about freedom, responsibility, and the infinite capacity of the human heart to heal and love again. Jessica would be proud to see her daughter flying free, protected by a new family that had been formed through tragedy, but strengthened through love and the determination to make a difference in each other's lives. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring everyday videos that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.